Okay, well, it is 1 o'clock, so we will get started. I see people are still trickling in, so I always like people to know that I do record these sessions. So, if you miss the beginning, if you have to jump off early, I will follow up and I'll include a recording. Of course, I hope you all can stay till the end. We do something really fun. These master classes are generously supported by our partners at Gift Suite. Gift Suite is this boutique gifting agency where the CEO, Sangeeta Verma, she's based out of Los Angeles. She basically handcrafts these incredible, eco-friendly, minority-led items from minority-led businesses, and just beautifully presented. So if you need thoughtful gifts for your clients, she also specializes in being able to ship internationally. So she is generously given members a prize. So stay to the end. I'll select a winner. And then Shane, yes, as a big thank you for being our presenter today. I'll be sending you one too. So I'll coordinate your details after. Feel free, the chat is enabled, and thank you, Dan, for confirming it works. Feel free if you guys want to do a little networking with each other, you can drop your LinkedIn. Both Shane and I have done that. We'd love to connect if you're not already connected with us. And for those that do not know me, I'm Danielle Patterson, CEO of Family Office List, and our platform is really designed to help you more efficiently connect with well-aligned family offices. The data is really there to help you do your due diligence on the family and decide if it's a good match. And that brings me to our topic today, due diligence, and to our expert guest speaker, Shane Pogue. So I'm so thrilled to have him here. Shane and I actually became acquainted on LinkedIn, and at some point in today's conversation, I'll ask us to share with the audience, how you leverage LinkedIn and how you go about, finding clients. So that we'll save for later in the conversation. But just a little on Shane. I'm not going to just read his bio because today's conversation will really be about his journey and his expertise. But just a little who aren't familiar with his work, he has a really unique backstory, which he'll share. And his professional journey didn't begin in finance. It actually began at the Ford Leonard Wood, Missouri 787th Military Police Battalion. And he actually had to leave the military due to a heart condition. But, like all things in life, he didn't let this setback hold him back. And so he joined VRC, which stands for Veracity Research Company, as a private investigator. And his passion for, unraveling these complexities and uncovering truths eventually led him to the financial industry. So I love these journeys. I didn't start in the financial industry either, but life has a way of leading us to where we're supposed to be. And, he uses his passion for unraveling complexity now in the financial industry, where he moved into the due diligence department. So he spent years at Fidelity, and once he had that entrepreneurial call, he decided to make the leap of faith, and he founded Aegis RSI, which is an outsourced due diligence, investigation, and risk management company. And they do things really uniquely. They have a great approach, which we'll talk about in today's presentation. But, before I go any farther, I'd love to turn things over and introduce you all to Shane. So Shane, thank you for being here. And if you'd like to, elaborate a little bit more, we can kind of start with the basics for this audience. Like, what is due diligence?
Well, due diligence actually has a lot of different facets to it. So in the way I'm talking about it and what Aegis does, it's basically a comprehensive and systematic approach to investigating vendors, potential investments, and even just business partners to just spot any potential risks or red flags, and in some cases even fraud very early on in the process. That way you can kind of protect yourself. And I actually love doing it. It's kind of a weird thing to say. It's a very long process. I think some of our investigations can take several days rather than, oh, you can get your work done in 8 hours. Sometimes you're working on it for an entire week. Sometimes you're working on it for 4 hours. It just depends on who you're investigating and what's there. When there's a lot of lawsuits, of course, you're going to take longer. But the real benefit of this type of due diligence is to make those informed decision-making steps early so that you have a good idea of who you're dealing with. And if God forbid we actually do spot potential fraud, you're able to protect yourself before you're already leveraged in that company to a point where the only way you're going to get your money back is through the courts.
Wow. So I'm sure every day of work is different for you, depending on the client and what their objective is, whether it's, investigating a potential investor, a potential client, and potential partner. You're also very right. There's so much that can go wrong, and these kind of mistakes can be painful. So you're pretty much mitigating risk by putting in the effort up front. And it's kind of like a loaded question when people ask, what is the definition of a family office? There's so many different definitions, and it really comes down to no two family offices are alike. So I'm sure in the world of due diligence, it kind of is the same. It really depends on the actual project at hand. I'd love to know, in this world of kind of due diligence and working with Fidelity, what was the type of due diligence work you were doing there?
So for Fidelity, we actually did pretty much anything the company needed. So you would do anything from digital assets to vendors to investments. So anything that the company needed due diligence on, that was the team I was on was responsible for that.
Wow. So tell us a little bit about, your process and how it maybe stands out from others in the field.
So my process is very heavily inspired by my time as a private investigator. So when I first started doing due diligence, I realized that it was actually really similar to the work I did as a private investigator, which we would sit there and we would try to spot fraud. We'd try to spot red flags, but it was mostly for like insurance claims, workman comp claims, things like that, where we might have a physical indication of fraud, but the reputation or the social media of a person might actually give them away if they're actually committing fraud. And one of the things I was really surprised about when I moved into normal due diligence is that they weren't really looking at that heavily. They weren't looking into social media and all this stuff. And another thing that really surprised me as a PI, I would always go and call county clerks, get court records that way if they weren't available online. And most due diligence companies won't go do that just because it's difficult. First of all, you have to kind of know how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, it might not be a productive task. Sometimes the county clerk, even if they have them, they'll tell you no. And then you have to kind of go through the process, or you're going to have to actually pay them to order the documents, which is not something a lot of companies are willing to do, especially like companies like Fidelity. They're trying to keep their costs low on areas where they're not making any money off of it. So due diligence is important, but it's also not producing any income. So they try to keep the cost low. So they're like, okay, just try to figure out what that court record was about. Don't go order the record. But Aegis will actually go and do that, or I'll have one of our investigators call the county clerk and kind of try to get the information out of them, even if it's just, hey, this isn't actually for our guy. It's just a very similar name or something like that. But calling to confirm is so important because that turns maybe we get a hit through a database, or maybe we see something online that indicates someone committed a crime and they have a similar name to our subject. Mm-hmm. And by calling that county clerk and counting that out, we can pull that out of our findings and make it more reliable and more trustworthy, and not to mention more ethically sound, because with what we do, sometimes you can kind of ruin a person's life by doing it wrong, because you can damage their reputation, even if later we're able to be like, oh, okay, never mind, we figured out that this isn't actually for this person. They don't have a DUI or anything like that. We've already made the claim, and by that time, our client's probably already moved on if they're going to end the relationship with that. So you have to be very careful on what you do, and you have to confirm everything, which was one of the reasons why I was so just dumbfounded when they were like, oh, we're not calling the county clerks to make sure.
Wow. So that is surprising. So yeah, your years of experience, you've kind of established these great connections and best practice protocols, and yeah, you're not going to skip any of those steps because a misstep can come back and bite someone and cost them in the long run. So by putting this effort up in the beginning, and that's interesting too, what you said. I think I do my own due diligence every time I hop on a call. I love LinkedIn because it allows me to do my own little, investigative research. So I come prepared. I know, how to put myself in this person's shoes and how to talk to them from a place of, experience and connection. But that would be interesting surprising to hear that in doing your own line of due diligence at other firms that they don't necessarily turn to social. And I wonder if they feel it's not a trusted source, where I think, this is what the person is putting out about themselves. If it's, it's the most telling, I think, at least the persona they're trying to create. So.
Oh, definitely. I always tell our people that they're investigators first, researchers second, and analysts third, because that's what the mindset I want them to approach it with. If you don't have information, I want you to either say, I have confirmed I cannot get it, or find a way to get it. For example, one of the really hilarious things we do, none of us speak French, but sometimes we will have a subject in France, and we will actually go search French courts, even though none of us speak French. It is very difficult because we have to rely heavily on translation tools, but we're able to do that because we knew that, hey, we know there's open courts in some parts of France. Let's go figure out what we can pull from there. And if we have to translate an entire document and spend extra time doing that, we're going to do it, because it's important that we take that step, even though I know some other, especially at Fidelity, that wasn't something we did, where we would try to go read other languages that we're not fluent in.
Yeah. I feel like you have to be an avid learner, very, very kind of hungry for knowledge and curious. So can you talk to us a little bit about your backstory and kind of, what led you to this career path, and kind of speaking to that curiosity? Have you ever always had this kind of curious nature?
Definitely always had the curious nature, but when I was younger, I actually wanted to be a scientist. I kind of got to that point where I actually went to college for criminal justice and forensics, so I kind of got that science side down at some point. But that's really where it started in college. I didn't actually want to join the field of investigations before I took my first criminal justice class, and I realized how similar it was to like the scientific process and you going through the investigations. And I'm like, oh, this is actually something I'm really interested in. And this is probably going to be funny, but I didn't have to do math or criminal justice, and I had to do a lot of math with science. So I was like, math isn't my strong subject. I can definitely do it, but that really impacted my decision. So I went into investigations and went through college for that. And my original plan was actually, I think you touched on it at the beginning, was to actually be a police officer, because I was trained in criminal investigations. And my roundabout way of doing that was to go be in the Army for a couple of years so that I could come back to Texas and get my certification as a police officer through the state, which they allow you to do if you're an MP. Of course, that didn't go out exactly how it was planned, because I ended up having a heart condition that we didn't really detect it during MEPS or anything. So it was a surprise to everyone. And once it was confirmed, I had an okay time in the military. But that first month or so, where they weren't really sure if I was just trying to trying to get out, because there's a lot of guys that do that, or if I was actually sick, it was crazy. But once I kind of was like, okay, this is something I have to plan for. My very next step when I got out was to go try to use my degree in other ways. And that's what led me to be a PI. Absolutely loved being a PI. It was very difficult though. A lot of respect for anyone that does that job all the time, because it's long hours, a whole bunch of work, and just every day is a rush.
Mm.
And I mean, sometimes I feel like that with what I do now, but it's not 100% all the time. Sometimes I can calm down a little bit, take breaks, and that just didn't exist in that role.
Yeah, I imagine.
But of course, the pandemic kind of messed that up a little bit, where no one really needed an PI during the pandemic. So I I ended up moving to Fidelity, like I think literally less than 2 weeks after I left VRC.
Mhm.
And then it just kind of kept going from there to due diligence. And now I'm here.
Amazing. Well, in prior conversations, you shared with me a lot about the different clients you work with and how, no two projects are quite the same. You deal a lot in real estate, in crypto, in venture capital, or, family offices. Um, I would be curious to hear more kind of about these different industries, maybe some case studies or examples kind of those various projects, and really how your skills help ensure that those transactions or those investments go over smoothly.
Yeah. So yes, I work with a lot of different places. I even work with some small businesses just doing like kind of vendor management for them, because one of our philosophies at Aegis is actually we want to provide due diligence to places where you typically couldn't afford it. So like with these smaller businesses, they're just as susceptible to fraud as a big family office or a VC firm, but they have basically no protection because no one's looking out for them. So in actually, it was a smaller real estate investor that had actually contracted us to do a vendor risk assessment of a guy that was doing contracting work on the area that they're working. And I was going through the guy's profiles, looking through everything, and then I see this little criminal charge, and I'm like, okay, that's weird. So it turns out he actually was not supposed to be working at a contractor anymore, because he had been in trouble for stealing from another place he was a contractor on, like from tenants' apartments while he was working there.
Yeah.
And luckily they sent that in. It was kind of funny because I'd actually talked to them only a few days before that for the first time,
Yeah.
and kind of gave them the rundown of when we expect them to send things in to kind of do the full risk mitigation, because we can do it later on and we might be able to mitigate some risk, but ideally when you send it in early, we can mitigate those risks early. So when we found this, of course, I highlighted it very heavily to our client, and I was like, hey, this is something that could be very dangerous for you, because especially because I found this. Now, if you hire this guy and he does do this again, you could be liable for this.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, I think about it just in my personal life. Yeah, like any vendor you go with, sure, we have social proof, we have online reviews, but for business, the world of business, you don't necessarily have that. So yeah, I can see where these extra steps are so important, and the types of things that you uncover. I'm sure clients are incredibly grateful. And I like that you have a flexible and affordable model, so it's not just exclusive to big firms, because I think even on an individual level, due diligence is so important, and for different businesses, they maybe don't have the time to do it. Can you kind of give some examples, or shed some light, like on any examples where you've seen, maybe not clients that you've worked with, because obviously they found you, they're doing the right things, but any examples of like what would happen if a client foregoes due diligence or doesn't put in the proper kind of time and focus?
Well, actually, I do have something that happened recently where someone had contacted me about performing due diligence for a client of theirs. And unfortunately, he was already too deep in the thing, which he'd gotten involved in a Ponzi scheme. He gave an investor money, and the investor they just distributed it out to fund their lifestyle. And then that's one of the big things that can happen. Ponzi schemes, those don't happen very often. I don't want to scare
Right.
everyone and be like,
Right.
this is something that
Yeah,
occurs
these
all the
they
time,
exist.
but they do occur. And in that situation, I had to be like, this is already in the courts. There's nothing I can do for you here.
Mm-hmm.
If this guy had sent this to me when he started investing, I probably would have been able to spot this. Okay. And I went out ahead and listed the different problems I found with the person in general. One was a complete lack of expertise to run the type of fund they were purporting to run, which just meant, hey, how is this guy doing this? Does he have like a really great mentor? Is there something there? And there's just no indication of him being able to do this. And his only real like role in the financial industry that I thought might be relevant was an internship.
Oh,
So I was like, okay, this isn't something this guy could realistically run. It doesn't matter how smart you are. If you don't have enough experience to run something like that, you're going to run into so many problems that when he's promising these big returns and all these great benefits to investing with him, and he just doesn't have any experience to do that, you have to question everything, especially in this case, it was a solo team. Like it was one person that was running the entire thing. And he freely admitted that he was one person running the entire thing.
You got to be really good at selling yourself. And I mean, I don't know if you just think you'll learn through experience, grow into it. But that's, yeah, wow. That's very shocking to see that people can even think they can get away with things like that. You did bring up a good point. Had this person run the diligence early before making the investment, you really could have saved them from a lot of that headache. When do you typically find it works best to get involved with your clients?
Usually I like to send them to send in when they first start to think about forming a business relationship. Sometimes even before they start talking to the company.
Yeah.
But if they're in the early stages, that's great too. That works. And then we definitely want it there because that's where we're going to be able to spot the red flags, the fraud, anything that might be an issue. Because it's not always red flags and fraud. Sometimes it's just minor issues that might affect how much you put into the investment. And that's really falls into the mitigating risk part rather than actually spotting fraud. Because sometimes it's just maybe the company has a couple issues. Maybe the firm we're working with can actually help them through those issues.
Yeah.
And it can be something where they're like, hey, maybe we need a little bit more control over you if we're going to buy you out because we see this issue here and we want to make sure this is properly dealt with. And it kind of informs the whole process. And yeah, if we do that early, you can get those discussions going very early and it's not like you're blindsiding them with different requests. Apart from that, we also like if it's a vendor or someone where you have a constant relationship with them and there's a high engagement value, you're spending lots of money. I would say you need to evaluate them every 1 to 2 years because things can definitely pile up, and you don't want to be the first time you notice an issue is, oh, there's a supply interruption or you get notified of a data breach. You kind of want to see those things happen before they become an issue. That way, if you're going to be liable for that data breach, you can mitigate the issue as best you can. And if you don't know about it and you're blindsided with it, you have to scramble, which of course, scramble takes more time than just dealing with it in a natural flow of the business.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's not just initial at the front, but it's kind of maintaining those relationships, not fully letting your guard down because, at the end of the day, things and people shift and you just want to make sure that everything's being done as it should be. So that's really great advice, is to kind of continue that risk mitigation throughout the relationship. Let's see, I'm interested, I know from working with clients who put together, say, like private placement memorandums for their investment opportunities. A lot of that is their own due diligence to kind of put any of the risks on the table so that the investors are well informed. And it kind of tries to create more transparency, like, yes, these are risks, but in your line of work, do you find there's a lot of crossover with lawyers? Are you delegating a lot of responsibility to legal teams? Is there, I'm just curious how that works. And do you advise that clients seek legal counsel in the type of work that you're doing for them?
Well, that's actually kind of an interesting topic because I actually say that due diligence is a team effort. So there are a bunch of different forms of due diligence. What I do, I like to call investigative due diligence. There's also legal due diligence, which means, yes, if there's an issue where it could possibly be a legal issue, I'm not going to say, oh, I can deal with that because that's not what I do. I'm going to advise them to go to someone that knows how to do it. It's the same thing with environmental due diligence. And this is specific, not like the business environment, but actual impact of environment on the environment that you encounter a lot in real estate investments. And I don't actually do that. I send them to someone else to go do that because due diligence is a team effort. Not only does the client have to be careful and mitigate risks themselves, they also have to send the risk to the appropriate parties to be evaluated so that they're not caught up in something down the road that they're just left down the creek without a paddle and can't really do anything about it because they've already been fined, they've already lost money, they've already engaged too heavily in the business and they can't pull out now.
Yeah.
So yeah, it definitely, if there is a issue I can't fix, I'm going to send them to someone else.
Well, I approach business in the exact same light. We cannot be all things to all people. You know, our expertise is the data and the insights. And, you know, when, for example, a client wants like a warm introduction or an in-person conference opportunity, that's where I have, you know, this ecosystem. And so I like that. I know in our earlier conversation, you mentioned there are limitations to, you know, the depth of due diligence you can do, but in all circumstances, you're completely transparent and honest and will find them the right partner if it's not you. So that's interesting. I'm sure your years of doing this work and having different projects, you must have a very extensive kind of network of people within the industry who specialize in different areas. Can you talk to some of the other areas outside of what you do at Aegis, but what other layers, like you said, it's a teamwork to do this due diligence. What other kind of experts should people think about as they enter these business relationships?
Well, I'm going to give the lawyer's favorite answer to that question. It depends.
Yes, I love it.
It's going to depend largely on what kind of investment you're making. If you're doing a vendor, of course, you probably don't need substantial legal due diligence except on the contract itself.
Mm-hmm.
You're probably not going to need operational due diligence on just if you're a limited partner on real estate investment, that wouldn't really be something we would send in for you because it's just not going to be that valuable. And yeah, there's a lot of different forms of due diligence. For example, there's financial due diligence where you're looking through business records. And I always tell people all the time, I cannot do financial due diligence for them. You need to find a finance person, you need to find a CPA, you need to find someone like that, or I will go find one for you if you can't find one.
There you go.
But those are just some of the situations you get in when you're trying to do due diligence. And especially right now, because what two of our biggest clients are family offices and real estate investors.
Okay.
And one of the big issues in those spaces is there's a huge disparity on whether or not they perform due diligence at all in some situations.
Wow.
I've had certain real estate investors told me that they were doing basic background checks through Checker for almost the entirety of their due diligence. And I've explained it to all my clients and I try to get the education out there, but yeah, it's a big disparity and you kind of have to maintain those networks just to help people out because actually our business slogan is literally we're here to help. So I try to help wherever I can.
Yes.
And by maintaining that network and kind of getting all these people together, and I am working on a bigger initiative of forming a network of people, an actual network rather than just my personal network that I can contact,
Yeah.
where people can actually go to this network and contact different experts and get help if it's something I can't deal with.
I love that approach. We are thinking of something very similar within the family office list. Of course, we have all of the family offices, but it's all of the vendors and the service providers and the fund managers. You know, we need to be flipping the dialogue and showcasing that network as well. And I love that, you know, most people, unless they've been burned and they've kind of had some of these terrible things happen without doing the due diligence, you know, they only know what they know. So it's nice that you can be that, almost like that advisory to connect them with, oh, well, have you thought of this, and asking them all the questions. And if, you know, you're not going to do it yourself, you're like, well, this is who you need to be speaking with. I think that's so valuable because, you know, you only know what you know. So you're an extension of their team that's taking care of all that risk mitigation. So we do have a question from the audience, and for the audience, like, please, this is as engaging as you would like it to be. You know, we're here for you. And Gary says, we are a solar developer about to purchase some solar assets, utility scale solar. We are purchasing this from a company, Y Energy Partners. can we have a conversation about our due diligence needs? So going to purchase assets.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Have you ever done a project in this area yet?
Yes, I have actually, but in this case, there's a lot of it depends in this as well. So with a partner like that, one of the things I always like to tell clients is I like to get on a call with them because I need to kind of know what the deal is about. I need to know how much money you're spending, what you've already done so far, what you're intending to do. That way I can properly advise you on the risk. Because if you're like, oh, I'm going to purchase some solar assets from someone, and by solar assets, you mean you're buying solar panels from your house, I'm of course not going to recommend our highest level of scrutiny investigation on that because it might be expensive. It might warrant looking into the person, but it's definitely not going to warrant me going into the huge depths. If you're talking about a huge acquisition of solar assets from someone, I would say you would definitely need to do, first of all, my form of due diligence. You would definitely need the legal due diligence part. You would most likely want to do operational due diligence as well on them, but that's actually on your end. So operational due diligence can largely be handled by you. You just need to make sure that the operational aspects of that business are sound and that what you're purchasing is what you're getting.
Mm-hmm.
Because if it's not, if you don't have someone going out and actually inspecting these assets,
Boots on
you
the
need
ground.
to have that.
Yeah.
That's actually one really good thing about working with real estate investors is they're very good about that kind of due diligence, actually going out to properties and inspecting them. And it's the same concept with things like solar assets and stuff like that. You need to go out there and you need to make sure that that stuff is sound because there's so many stories of instances of fraud where it's not what they thought it was, or God forbid, in some cases, it just didn't exist.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. It's a crazy world we live in. Well, thank you for answering, Gary. And we've got one from Teresa. Hi, Teresa. I want to build a tech startup and I'll be a first time founder. What should my top priorities, aspects when conducting due diligence with investors, for example? And then there's a second part to the question. What common mistakes do startups make during the due diligence process from your experience?
Well, one thing I definitely say about your top priorities in due diligence is look into the investors that are investing in your company. It is very dangerous to just accept any money that is given to you. You need to evaluate these people properly. You need to make sure you're looking into their backgrounds. You need to make sure you're looking into deals that they've made in the past, because if you don't do that, what's going to happen is some of these VC firms, I'm not saying this is bad or wrong, but some of them will seek to take complete control of the company rather than allow you to do your startup and run it how you run it. They get more and more control of the company over time until basically in some situations they'll try to force the original founder out so that they can make the company more profitable, especially if they're kind of more bottom line approach to business. And in some cases, they're actually really, really great to work with. And you need to be very aware of that. You should know very keenly who you're doing business with. And what common mistakes do startups make? From a due diligence experience, it's what the VC firm is looking at is they're going to look at your experience running companies. So as a first-time founder, of course, you probably don't have a lot of experience running companies. So they're going to look, hey, do you have experience in the field where you're claiming to be able to start? Now, that might not necessarily shut the deal down if you don't have that, but you also need to be transparent about certain things so that you're not giving the impression that you can do things you can't. Be very honest with them. Don't try to beef up your business with lies. It's never going to work. Someone's going to look at it and it's going to be a red flag. If someone like me were to see you spouting something on social media about your business opening this big facility and I go look for that facility and it's not there, I'm going to consider that a red flag. I'm like, they're saying they have this 300 square foot facility in Delaware and it doesn't exist. I have no records of it. And that's going to turn into a red flag rather than you just not saying that little lie that might seem okay in the moment, but overall it's going to create challenges for you. So remember, just be honest, be ethical, and most importantly, pay attention to who you're doing business with and pay attention to your team as well. Because, and I would recommend background checking your own team. I know a lot of startups fail in that aspect, which means that they miss things. Now, you don't necessarily need to do what I do for that. A normal background check is more than sufficient for teams. But you definitely need to be background checking your team, because if it turns out that, for example, you've known this guy for years and they'd committed fraud in the past, if someone were to, like me, were to find that and he had control, he was a C-suite level executive or something in the company, we are now going to consider that a high risk, because we don't know that guy for how many years. We don't know the story. All we see is that he was convicted of fraud 20 years ago, and we're going to list that. And when you say fraud in my space, it's an immediate big red flag that usually shuts down deals.
And I love that you brought up, that it's really great to kind of know what this investor's intentions are, because there's so many different types of investors. A family office is kind of notorious for being that long term, with the patient capital. They aren't looking for immediate returns. But again, no two family offices alike. Some of them want involvement. They may want to be on your board, where some will kind of give you the capital. It really depends. So I encourage people, we have a investor playbook, is to first and foremost ask yourself, what is the role of this investor? And I know sometimes it just feels desperate. It's so hard to raise capital. You're like, I just want to check. But investors can bring so much beyond just the mere, capital to the table. There's so many other forms of value. And so asking yourself those questions, and then kind of course, being prepared for the questions they're going to ask you, but not being afraid to ask them the questions as well, because it's a match, and it's a match of culture. And it's also, if they are going to be involved in your day-to-day, do you actually enjoy doing business with them? Because people do business with people. And I think, speaking to, as a first-time founder, some people get so caught up on, this idea of track record, but people invest with people. And if they believe in you as the founder based on, the plan you have and the vision and the passion, I think, the past record is less important. So yeah, that's just my little 2 cents. We have a question from, let's see, where did it go? Ibe, and I apologize if I mispronounce your name, but he says, to your point of disparity of companies performing due diligence, why do you believe more don't undertake this critical step? Is it generally cost prohibitive? Yeah, I was very curious to talk about costs, and I know your company is very flexible and treats each project differently, but yeah, can you talk to us? Let's, like, why doesn't everyone do this?
Well, one is first education, and that's a lot of what I'm doing right now. I'm going on classes like this. I'm telling people about due diligence, and some people don't even know this is a thing you can do. One of the most common questions I get is this something we can actually do? Because they understand that there are privacy laws like the FCRA, which govern background checks. And this isn't really the same thing as a background check. It's not governed by the FCRA. Because of that, we have to be very careful about what we do and what we say during it. But generally, if you could be harmed by fraud, or your reputation could be harmed by fraud, you can conduct a check like this, which is a much lower requirement than the whole disclosure requirement with the FCRA, which is a very long process, and it varies by background check agency. So yes, it is cost prohibitive, because we are a step above doing a background check. We're checking a huge amount of risks on every case. Usually it can range, like I said before, it can range anywhere from a 4-hour check on someone that doesn't really have any information on them, or they're just squeaky clean and we never get anything, to a several days long investigation that just goes into a whole bunch of detail on legal cases that they've been involved with, a whole bunch of media findings, just to give you a good overview of who you're dealing with. And that's why it is cost prohibitive, because sometimes we will spend a lot of time on it. And that's actually one of the big benefits my company offers, is we're more flexible on our prices. We kind of build that kind of disparity between the different subject types that take a little bit longer into our prices, so that if, for example, your case takes 3 days for us to complete, we're not charging you for 3 days of work. We're just going to charge you our base price still, because at the end of the day, we can go back and we can do another case that only takes us 4 hours, and it kind of balances it out for us.
I admire that. There's a lot of bigger players in the space. You've got the Preqin, the Pitch Books, the FinTreks out there, and they're offering this data, but it's so prohibitive for like a startup founder, an emerging fund manager, and these are the people that need the help the most. And so I really admire that you are creating solutions that aren't just exclusive or out of reach. I think that's great. So we have a question from Sumi, and it's actually two questions. They're completely separate. So we'll start with number one, and then once you've answered, I'll go on to two. But investing in AI and pre-seed funds, what are your thoughts?
Ooh, for AI, it's definitely okay, first off, not a financial advisor.
Right. Yes,
So
disclaimer.
disclaimer off the bat. In investing in AI, there's going to be a lot of fraud in that space coming up. Just because there's going to be, anytime there's a big boom, just like when the crypto was booming, well, it still is a little bit, but when it was booming, there was so much fraud in the space. So you're going to want to meticulously vet any AI investment you make, because those places, it's a new technology, first off. You're going to have people that can actually make good changes in the field that don't have a lot of experience. So there's not going to be those initial red flags that we usually look for, where if he was running a hedge fund and claiming he can run a hedge fund, we can of course be like, okay, that's a little bit weird because you've never ran a hedge fund before or even worked at a company that ran hedge funds. But with AI, it's so new that you don't really have that. You can go, oh, okay, well, they haven't really worked with computers before and kind of do it a little bit, but it's going to be a little bit more difficult. And some people are going to become experts in the field by just working very hard. And for pre-seed funds, I would say it's pretty much the same thing. Anytime there's a space where they're investing in these startup companies, you're going to want to perform due diligence, just because there's so much fraud in the investment space that just, in some cases, it goes unreported just because there's not a lot they can do. Until it goes to the courts, they're just SOL. So,
all right, so question number two, and thank you for that great answer. When doing M&A, is RWI insurance, and Sumit, I'll have you, if you know the acronym, I'm not familiar with RWI insurance. So when doing M&A, is RWI insurance recommended for an acquisition?
You'd have to define that for me as well. There are so many acronyms in the space.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, so for example, in investigations, there's actually a special name for open source media investigations that I don't use because it's an acronym and no one knows what you're talking about outside the space.
So I always have to remind myself, like with development and finance, it's kind of like a joke, all these, your tech stack and your, but yeah. So Sumit, if you're still on, we'd love to know, all of us probably here on the call, is what RWI insurance stands for. But yeah, I guess a broader question just about doing mergers and acquisitions. I mean, I can only imagine my husband, he's done his 14th acquisition to date. And, it's when you're merging companies like that, it's tremendous. So RWI insurance, or representations and warranties insurance, is a typical coverage used primarily in mergers and acquisition transactions. It provides protection to buyers and sellers against financial losses that may arise from breaches of representations and warranties made by the seller in the acquisition agreement.
Sure. No, that is actually a great idea. I would definitely recommend, if there's an insurance that covers that, I'm not an insurance expert, but typically insurance is good in those situations, especially in mergers and acquisitions. If you can get someone to cover that, that's good. The idea behind what I do is that you wouldn't need that insurance because you'd be able to mitigate the risk early on. Yeah. Not saying you shouldn't get that insurance still, but it would limit how you would interact with these companies rather than you having to be like, oh, I'm going to take out this insurance policy to make sure I'm not screwed. Because at the end of the day, the insurance policy might not cover all your losses. And that's just any insurance policy, better whether it's auto, health, or whatever. You can have losses that are incurred that they just not going to cover the full thing. So then you then of course you have to go through the courts and get the rest of it back, and that takes years. So that's actually a good risk management strategy to do something like what I do. Keep that insurance if you decide to go through with the acquisition or merger, and then keep performing the due diligence regularly, especially if this is going to be a continuing relationship or it takes several years to complete the merger and acquisition. That way you can spot these issues early on and make sure that your company is not going to take a huge loss or have to go through the courts, because I know I've said this several times, but it takes years to get money out of the courts. It takes years, and it's just not a good situation to be in, especially if you're a smaller business and that money is something you need.
Yeah. Wow. Interesting concept. And yeah, it is really valuable to know that these insurances exist. And you bring up a good point. It's just knowing all of those special cases and making sure there's no loopholes in that policy that wouldn't protect you from some of the special cases. Yeah, I know sometimes when these lawyers become involved and you go into these court cases, you're like, I think the only ones winning are the lawyers, it's like long and painful. So anything you can do ahead of time to prevent those situations. Let's see, are there any other questions from the audience? You guys have been amazing. Thank you for keeping this so engaging. Any specific industry questions that you have, or fields that maybe we haven't spoke about or talked upon?
Let me think off the top of my head. I do have a couple of interesting stories I could tell.
I would love to. I'm all about. I mean, that's the thing. I think, unfortunately, like knock on wood, many of us haven't had to run into these, but we learn through thinking about it and being aware. And stories are kind of the best way that we can kind of.
Yeah. One really, actually, so I did this for I can't say specific names, of course, because of client confidentiality, but for recently I did, actually it's about a month ago, so not really recently, lost track of time, but it's okay. I did a case for a VC firm where they wanted to invest in this small tech startup. And I was looking through this guy's profile, trying to find any information about him, and he had a name, and I was like, okay, so I'm looking at this name and I don't see anything on it, which is weird. Normally you're going to find something on a person. So I start just thinking about like, okay, so why might a person not have any known names? And of course the first thing that goes in my mind is that they have a different name. Mm-hmm. So I as kind of like a last ditch effort to figure out if he was using a different name, I actually searched the National Sex Offender Registry just to be a little bit careful, and that alias popped up. And it turned out this guy has been using this different name for years, and it wasn't a legal name or anything. It's just something he used. It was his first name and middle name. And that popped up the whole case, where I was like, okay, now I know his actual name. I've got his address. I got all this stuff. And he's on the sex offender registry. I have to go, I think it was in Virginia. I had to go and figure out like what happened here, pull out all the details of the case, because that could be very important. It was like 30 years ago, but it's still very important. And he's still required to register, which means big red flag there. So I went through, and of course the VC firm was not happy about that, because that was the first time they heard of that from him. And being currently registered was one of the big issues. If it was 30 years ago and it was an issue of him being off the registry, they said they might have worked with it, but it was an issue of reliability. It was an issue of both trust and reliability at that point, because basically they disclosed that they were going to do a background check on him, and he agreed. And then when this happened, he was basically like, oh yeah, that happened like 30 years ago. It's no big deal.
He was just hoping maybe they wouldn't go through the process and he just wouldn't even have to talk about it. But it's like, you know what? Just got to be forthcoming, be more there'd be more integrity in your explaining before they come and find it. Yeah, because then it questions, well, what else did we not find?
Yeah. And that's a big thing in investigations as well, and is ethics. You definitely always need to have cause to investigate a person, and you also always need to be on the lookout for possible conflicts of interest. For example, ooh, sorry, talked for too long.
There you go.
Um, for example, my wife is actually Samoan and Tongan, and that's a very small community. One of the actual challenges I've faced in my investigations is the fact that whenever I investigate someone with a Tongan or Samoan name, her grandma usually knows them, so I have to stop the investigation and hand it off to someone else.
Oh my
So
God.
you have to kind of be aware of conflicts of interest in situations like that. And it's like, yeah, that's probably her third cousin twice removed, but even that sense that I might know that person or that I've been to a family event with them could be a conflict of interest for me, especially if they're a cousin, because that's investigating family. You never do that. But no, ethics is very important in any business. Doesn't matter if you're a startup founder. It doesn't matter if you're running family office list. It doesn't matter if you're a private investigator, a due diligence analyst. You need to be ethically sound, and you need to be constantly thinking about, hey, is this an issue? Is this something that could possibly cause problems? Could it damage my professional reputation if I did it this way?
Reputation is everything, and in these days it's trust, can I trust you? When you provide your clients with your findings, do you then provide counsel, guidance on how to perceive your findings? That's a great question, eBay.
Yes, we do actually. Not always. So we allow the client to schedule a meeting to discuss what we found. We always include it as a link. So basically what we do, we send out a report, which will have all our investigation findings in there. And then at the end of that email, we'll have a little blurb that says you can schedule a meeting here with whoever was responsible for investigating it. That way they can go out and get the extra help with the findings they need. Because sometimes the findings aren't something that needs to be explained. It's no findings, or it's some very basic stuff, like we find that he had a DWI 20 years ago and we put it in the report, but it's not something we necessarily need to explain.
Right.
So we give them the option to do it rather than doing it on every case, because in certain situations, it'd be maybe a minute long call where it'd be like, yeah, we didn't find anything, bye.
Yeah. Well, and I like that. I feel like clients are getting the best value. They're really getting what they need, and they're in the driver's seat. Like if they need more, they're able to get that. But it's not just a one size fits all. It's a very tailored service you're providing. And that I could imagine you're like, oh my gosh, so now what? And now I have the information, but what do I do with the information? So that's nice that you can offer that next step.
And we're definitely very careful about how we present information too. We're never going to present something that we're unsure of, and we're never going to speculate on something. So we're not going to be like, oh, well, we found this and this, which could indicate this.
Right, right.
We're going to if we see something that could indicate a red flag that's related to fraud, we're just going to list that finding and be like, okay, here's what we found. And then we'll adjust our risk rating depending on that finding. We're not going to tell you, oh, this guy's definitely committing fraud, because that goes back to ethics. It's possible that this is something innocent that we found, and it's not necessarily something you would need to divest from the business from.
I'm curious, have you ever worked with clients who they have operational businesses and they almost want to do like an audit of their employees, because you imagine, sure, everyone has their protocols in place for hiring and they have business as normal, but just to almost like audit that everyone's doing what they should be as they should be. Have you ever worked with a client on that level?
No, we haven't. It is something that would be interesting though. Like I said before, in cases like that, a background check's probably a better tool for that. Though I would add the caveat, if you are talking about a senior executive or someone like that that has a lot of controlling power, usually you do something like what I do. You do investigative due diligence on them on top of the background check, because you want to look for those issues. You want to see his work history. You want to make sure that he didn't appear in a media article from 10 years ago for sexual harassment or something like that, that you might not, well, you definitely wouldn't catch that in a background check. Background check companies don't check for that kind of stuff.
I'm thinking of a particular case study where a company had a C-level executive that was like covering up communication to one of their vendors, and it turns out like they weren't paying the invoices, and so there was a security breach, and it was like, well, why didn't the company do their job doing the security? Well, it turns out it was just this messy web, and you're like, how did no one catch that? And so it's almost like you either need like an in-house person, or to assign those sorts of tasks. And like you said, it's not just maybe at the initial relationship, but it's the maintenance where you can't let your guard down. You never know.
And in situations like that, it's really important for, well, in general, for your vendors to have several points of control. Mm-hmm. One person should not be controlling the entirety of your vendor risk management.
Yeah.
You should be rotating that person occasionally.
That's true.
That sounds really operationally challenging, but it really prevents fraud, because what happens in internal fraud like that, where it's them not paying a vendor and there being problems, if there was another person in that room, that vendor would have contacted that other person and said, hey, we're spotting this issue. And then that would have been mitigated very quickly, rather than it becoming a huge issue where there's a breach and all kinds of stuff, and there's a huge investigation, there's tons of money lost. Doing the risk mitigation steps early is really how you avoid things.
Yeah. So we have a series of questions from Sumit. He says, I would give someone a chance who has had a criminal record if it was not related to fraud, for example, possession of cannabis. What do you both think?
Actually, so depending on for example, in our risk rating system, there is different levels of criminal finding. So a misdemeanor possession of cannabis, we're going to note it, but it's going to actually not carry very much weight. Now, if they were arrested for trafficking drugs or selling cannabis, it's going to be weighted higher because that's a felony. But no, if it's a misdemeanor possession of cannabis and I uncover it, it's not going to be given that much weight, actually.
Yeah, I think exactly, like case by case, depends on the person, their role, and what that was. Like I kind of joke, my girlfriend in college had a fake ID, but it like stayed on her record, and she's the CEO of a huge company now, but it was like an issue at the time that she got hired, and it was like, oh, I gotta like explain myself. And in that case, they were like, we get it, we've all been in college and done stupid things, but it's like, I like that you kind of have a systematic points approach to it, Shane, where you can kind of the degree of breaking the law. Well, this was amazing. I'm so thankful to the audience for being so interactive. And Shane, thank you for sharing your expertise. I mean, this definitely gives us a new perspective of going into partnerships, business investments. And it's really important that we're aware of the importance of taking the time to really kind of properly know who we're doing business with. I am going to award Gary Gustafsson today our gift suite prize. So I'll reach out to you after. Thank you everyone for a great learning experience today. And I'll be sure to send the recording so you can share it with others that you think might benefit.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you, Shane. I didn't even get to talk to you about LinkedIn and the work you're doing there. But everyone can find your LinkedIn URL, and I'll be sure to include how people can get in touch with you in the follow-up.
Yes, you can search me on LinkedIn.